In the year 563 BCE, in a small kingdom nestled between the towering peaks of the Himalayas and the fertile plains of the Ganges, a child was born who would fundamentally alter the spiritual landscape of humanity. His birth was surrounded by prophecy and wonder, yet the man he would become would reject everything that prophecy promised. This is the story of how a prince abandoned his palace to become a beggar, how a seeker nearly died in pursuit of truth, and how that truth would eventually reach every corner of the world. But before we dive into this extraordinary journey, I need you to do something for me. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue bringing you these deep explorations into the lives that shaped our world. I'm genuinely curious where you're watching from today and what draws you to stories like this one. Now settle in as we travel back over 2,500 years to ancient India to witness the birth of the man who would become known as the Buddha, the awakened one. The kingdom of Kapilavastu was prosperous but small, a buffer state caught between the great powers of ancient India. Its ruler, King Siddhartha of the Shakya clan, governed with wisdom and strength, but like all rulers of his time, he understood that power was fragile and dynasties could crumble in a single generation. The continuation of his lineage weighed heavily on his mind, especially as his queen, Maya Devi, had struggled for years to conceive an heir. When Maya finally became pregnant, the entire kingdom held its breath. Ancient Indian tradition demanded that a woman return to her father's home to give birth, and so Queen Maya began the journey to Devadaha, her childhood palace. But fate, it seems, had different plans. As her procession passed through the beautiful gardens of Lumbini, the queen felt the first pangs of labour. According to the texts that would be written centuries later, what happened next defied the natural order. The queen, grasping the branch of a sal tree for support, gave birth standing up. The child emerged from her right side, took 7 steps in each cardinal direction, and declared that this would be his final rebirth. Lotus flowers bloomed beneath his feet with each step he took. The earth trembled, celestial music filled the air, and a gentle rain fell from a cloudless sky to bathe the newborn prince. Modern minds might dismiss these details as religious mythology, but they reveal something profound about how this child's life would be remembered. From the very moment of his birth, those who knew his story understood that something unprecedented had entered the world. They named him Siddhartha, meaning he who achieves his goal, though the goal he would ultimately achieve was nothing his royal family could have imagined. 7 days after giving birth, Queen Maya died. This tragic loss would cast a shadow over young Siddhartha's early years, and perhaps planted the first seeds of the questions that would eventually consume him. Death, he learned before he could even walk, comes for everyone, even the most beloved and beautiful. His aunt and stepmother, Mahapajapati, raised him with tender care, but the absence of his birth mother created a wound that luxury could never heal. King Siddhartha was determined that his son would follow the traditional path of a Shakya prince. The boy would be educated in statecraft and warfare, would marry well, would produce heirs, and would eventually take the throne. But shortly after Siddhartha's birth, a sage named Asita visited the palace. This was no ordinary court astrologer or flattering priest. Asita was renowned throughout the region for his spiritual insight and his complete indifference to royal favour. The old sage examined the newborn prince with great care, studying the marks on his body with the intensity of a scholar reading ancient texts. What he saw filled him with both wonder and sorrow. The child bore the 32 marks of a great being, signs that pointed to an extraordinary destiny. But that destiny, Asita revealed, could take one of 2 paths. If the prince remained in the palace and embraced worldly life, he would become a Chakravartin, a universal monarch who would unite all of India under his rule. But if he encountered the realities of suffering and chose to seek spiritual truth, he would become something else entirely. He would become a fully awakened being, a teacher whose wisdom would illuminate the darkness of ignorance for countless generations. The prophecy should have filled King Siddhartha with pride. Either path promised greatness for his son, but the old sage's tears revealed a troubling truth. Asita wept because he was too old to witness the prince's awakening. He knew that Siddhartha would choose the spiritual path, would abandon his royal birthright, and would become a teacher whose influence would surpass that of any earthly king. From that moment forward, King Siddhartha's entire reign became focused on a single mission, ensuring that his son never encountered anything that might turn his thoughts towards spiritual seeking. If Siddhartha never saw suffering, never questioned the nature of existence, never met a holy man, or heard teachings about liberation, then surely he would remain content with palace life and fulfill his destiny as a great king. The king constructed what amounted to a beautiful prison. 3 palaces were built for the prince, one for each season, each more magnificent than the last. The grounds were filled with every pleasure imaginable: gardens where flowers bloomed perpetually, lakes stocked with exotic fish, pavilions where musicians played day and night. The prince was surrounded by beautiful companions, skilled teachers, and servants whose only job was to ensure his happiness. But this was not mere indulgence. Every person who entered the prince's presence was carefully selected. Anyone who showed signs of illness, aging, or distress was barred from the palaces. The prince was to see only youth, health, beauty, and joy. Death was never mentioned in his presence. Even the flowers in his gardens were replaced before they could wilt. It was an attempt to create a world without impermanence, a realm where the fundamental truths of existence could be hidden indefinitely. Young Siddhartha thrived in this carefully constructed paradise. He proved to be an exceptional student, mastering not only the traditional subjects of a prince's education, but showing particular brilliance in philosophy and debate. His teachers marveled at his ability to grasp complex concepts with ease and to see connections that escaped older, more experienced minds. In martial arts and athletics, he demonstrated both natural talent and dedicated practice, becoming skilled with sword and bow, excelling in wrestling and chariot racing. But perhaps most remarkably, the prince showed an early inclination toward compassion that went far beyond the conventional noblesse oblige expected of royalty. Stories from his youth describe him rescuing injured animals, sharing his food with servants, and showing genuine concern for the welfare of everyone around him. There was something in his nature that seemed to naturally extend kindness to all living beings, as if he instinctively understood that the artificial boundaries between himself and others were ultimately meaningless. As Siddhartha entered his teenage years, King Siddhartha began to implement the next phase of his plan. The prince would need to be married, would need to develop strong attachments to family life that would make the thought of renunciation impossible. But finding a suitable bride for a prince who had been raised in such isolation presented unique challenges. The young woman would need to be not only beautiful and intelligent, but also committed to maintaining the carefully constructed illusion that surrounded palace life. The solution came in the form of Yasodhara, a princess from a neighbouring kingdom whose beauty and grace were renowned throughout the region. More importantly, she came from a family that understood the delicate situation and could be trusted to support the king's efforts to keep his son content with worldly life. The marriage was arranged with great care, and when Siddhartha reached the age of 16, the wedding was celebrated with unprecedented magnificence. By all accounts, the marriage was genuinely happy. Yasodhara was not merely a political arrangement, but a true companion for the prince. She was intelligent enough to engage his quick mind, beautiful enough to captivate his aesthetic sense, and wise enough to understand the unique pressures of being married to someone destined for greatness. For 13 years, their life together seemed to vindicate King Siddhartha's strategy. Siddhartha appeared content with palace life, devoted to his wife, and increasingly skilled in the arts of governance. The king began to relax, believing that his son had chosen the path of worldly engagement. Plans were made for gradually increasing Siddhartha's involvement in ruling the kingdom. The prince began sitting in on council meetings, learning the intricate balance of diplomacy and force that kept their small kingdom independent. He showed natural aptitude for leadership and genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. But beneath the surface of this apparent contentment, questions were stirring in Siddhartha's mind. The very perfection of his environment began to seem unnatural, even suspicious. Where were the old people he occasionally glimpsed through palace windows? Why did servants sometimes seem to disappear without explanation? Why did his father become evasive when asked about certain aspects of ruling, particularly those involving conflict or suffering? The prince's intelligence, so carefully cultivated by his tutors, was beginning to work against his father's plan. A mind trained to see patterns and connections could not be indefinitely deceived by even the most elaborate illusion. Siddhartha began to suspect that there were the aspects of existence that were being hidden from him, and that suspicion grew into a determination to discover the truth. The catalyst came in his 29th year, when Yasodhara gave birth to a son. The child was named Rahula, meaning fetter or impediment, a name that revealed more about Siddhartha's state of mind than anyone realized at the time. Rather than feeling joy at the birth of an heir, the prince felt an unexpected sense of being bound, trapped in a web of responsibilities and expectations that seemed to be closing around him. It was then that Siddhartha made a decision that would change everything. He would venture beyond the palace walls and see for himself what lay in the world outside his protected existence. The young prince, who had been raised to become a king, was about to take the first steps on a journey that would lead him far from any throne, into depths of seeking that would test the very limits of human endurance. The decision to leave the palace grounds was not made lightly. For weeks, Siddhartha wrestled with a growing sense of restlessness that no amount of luxury could satisfy. The birth of his son had awakened something profound within him, a recognition that the cycle of existence he was perpetuating might contain truths he had never been permitted to discover. The very walls that had protected him now felt like barriers to understanding. His opportunity came when the kingdom prepared for a festival celebrating the spring harvest. The prince requested permission to join the festivities in the city, to see how his future subjects lived and celebrated. King Suddhodana could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from his heir, but he took extraordinary precautions. The entire route was cleared and cleaned. Every building along the prince's path was inspected and decorated. Citizens who might present an unsightly appearance were relocated for the duration of the visit. Even the animals were selected for their health and beauty. But human nature, it seems, resists even the most careful orchestration. As Siddhartha's golden chariot rolled through the streets of Kapilavastu, accompanied by his faithful charioteer, Channa, the prince marvelled at the vibrant life surrounding him. The colours, sounds, and energy of the city were intoxicating after a lifetime of palace tranquility. Yet something nagged at his consciousness, a sense that this too perfect scene was somehow incomplete. Then it happened. An elderly man, bent with age and leaning heavily on a walking stick, stumbled into the street. His hair was white as snow, his skin wrinkled and spotted, his movements slow and painful. The palace guards moved quickly to escort him away, but not before Siddhartha had seen him clearly. The prince called for his chariot to stop. "Channa," he said, his voice filled with wonder and confusion. "What manner of man is this? Why does he walk with such difficulty? Why is his hair the colour of moonlight?" The charioteer found himself in an impossible position. He had served the royal family faithfully for years and understood the king's wishes, but he could not lie to his prince's direct question. With great reluctance, he explained that this was an old man, that all human beings who lived long enough would eventually reach this state of physical decline and weakness. The revelation struck Siddhartha like lightning. You mean this will happen to me? To you? To Yasodhara? To everyone in the palace?" Channa nodded sadly, and in that moment, the first crack appeared in the carefully constructed illusion that had shaped the prince's entire worldview. But this was only the beginning. On subsequent excursions from the palace, each carefully orchestrated, yet somehow allowing glimpses of reality to slip through, Siddhartha encountered the second and third of what would later be called the four sights. He saw a man racked with disease, his body consumed by fever and pain, crying out for relief that would not come. The prince learned that illness could strike anyone at any time, that the healthy bodies he had always taken for granted were fragile vessels subject to countless forms of suffering. Then came the sight that shattered his world completely. A funeral procession wound its way through the streets, mourners wailing as they carried a body toward the burning grounds outside the city. Death, that ultimate reality from which he had been so carefully shielded, revealed itself in all its finality. The prince discovered that every person he had ever loved, every joy he had ever experienced, every moment of beauty and pleasure was temporary. Everything he cherished would eventually be lost to the inexorable passage of time. The weight of these revelations pressed down on Siddhartha with crushing force. How could he return to palace pleasures knowing that they were built on such a foundation of impermanence? How could he laugh and feast and make love knowing that age, sickness, and death waited for everyone he cared about? The luxury that had once delighted him now seemed like a cruel joke, a desperate attempt to ignore truths that demanded acknowledgement. But it was the fourth sight that changed everything. On what would be his final journey outside the palace walls, Siddhartha encountered a wandering ascetic, a holy man who had renounced all worldly possessions in search of spiritual liberation. The man's face radiated a peace that seemed impossible given his circumstances. He owned nothing, had no home, no family, no security, yet there was something in his eyes that spoke of a freedom the prince had never seen in all his years surrounded by luxury. When Siddhartha questioned this wanderer, the man spoke of a path beyond suffering, a way of understanding that could transcend the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death. He spoke of liberation not through accumulation or pleasure, but through the complete understanding of existence itself. The prince pressed him for details, hungry for any glimpse of hope, but the ascetic simply smiled and continued on his way, leaving Siddhartha with more questions than answers. That night, as the prince lay beside his sleeping wife, with their infant son in his arms, the full magnitude of his situation became clear. He could not unknow what he had learned. The suffering inherent in existence could not be ignored simply by surrounding oneself with beautiful things. Yet neither could he continue living as if these truths did not matter. The very love he felt for Yasodhara and Rahula made their inevitable suffering unbearable to contemplate. The palace, once a paradise, had become a prison of a different sort. Every pleasure now reminded him of its impermanence. Every moment of happiness was shadowed by the knowledge of future loss. The prince found himself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to participate in the courtly life that had once given him such satisfaction. King Suddhodana watched his son's transformation with growing alarm, sensing that the carefully laid plans of nearly 3 decades were crumbling. Desperate to restore his son's contentment, the king arranged ever more elaborate entertainments. The most skilled musicians in the kingdom were summoned to play. The most beautiful dancers performed nightly. Rare delicacies were prepared by master cooks, but nothing could distract Siddhartha from his newfound awareness. If anything, the excessive luxury only deepened his sense of the futility of trying to escape life's fundamental realities through pleasure and distraction. The final catalyst came during a festival night when the king had organized the most spectacular celebration yet. As the evening wore on and wine flowed freely, the entertainers and courtiers gradually succumbed to exhaustion and intoxication. When Siddhartha walked through the halls in the early hours before dawn, he saw bodies sprawled in sleep, mouths agape, makeup smeared, fine clothes dishevelled and stained. The sight was not particularly shocking by ordinary standards, merely the natural aftermath of celebration. But to the prince's awakened consciousness, it became a vision of the human condition itself. All the beauty, all the pleasure, all the desperate attempts to create meaning and joy were ultimately revealed as temporary distractions from deeper truths that demanded attention. The sleepers reminded him of corpses, their temporary unconsciousness, a preview of the permanent unconsciousness that awaited them all. Standing in those silent halls, surrounded by the evidence of life's transitory nature, Siddhartha made the decision that would define the remainder of his existence. He would leave everything behind. His throne, his wealth, his beautiful wife, his newborn son, his father's love and expectations. All of it would be abandoned in pursuit of answers to questions that had become more important to him than life itself. The decision was not made from callousness or lack of love. Indeed, it was made because his love for those around him had become so intense that he could not bear to watch them suffer without first discovering whether liberation from suffering was truly possible. If there was a way beyond the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death, he would find it. If there was not, at least he would know the truth rather than living in comfortable delusion. As the first light of dawn crept through the palace windows, Prince Siddhartha took one final look at his sleeping family. Yasodhara lay with their son cradled against her, both peaceful in their dreams, unaware that their world was about to change forever. The prince leaned down as if to kiss them farewell, then stopped, fearing that even the slightest touch might wake them and make his departure impossible. Instead, he whispered a silent promise. He would find the answers he sought, would discover the path beyond suffering, and would return to share that knowledge with all who needed it. The prince who'd been raised to rule a kingdom was about to begin a quest that would make him teacher to the world. Moving silently through corridors he had known since childhood, Siddhartha made his way to the stables where Channa waited with his horse, Kantaka. The faithful charioteer had guessed his master's intention, and despite his own heartbreak, had prepared for the journey. Together, they rode through the gates of Kapilavastu as the city slept, leaving behind everything that had defined the prince's identity for 29 years. At the banks of the river that marked his kingdom's border, Siddhartha dismounted and performed one final act of renunciation. Drawing his sword, he cut off his long hair, the symbol of his royal status. He removed his silk robes and jewels, trading them with a passing hunter for simple yellow cloth. The transformation was complete. Prince Siddhartha Gautama had ceased to exist. In his place stood a homeless seeker, possessing nothing but an unshakable determination to understand the nature of existence itself. The river that separated Siddhartha from his former life was not particularly wide or treacherous, yet crossing it felt like stepping between worlds. On one side lay everything he had ever known, every relationship that had given his life meaning, every comfort that had shaped his understanding of existence. On the other side stretched an unknown landscape of seeking, where the only certainty was uncertainty itself. Channa stood on the riverbank watching his prince disappear into the forest, tears streaming down his weathered face. He would return to the palace alone, carrying news that would shatter King Suddhodana's heart and leave Queen Yasodhara to raise their son without ever truly understanding why her husband had abandoned them. But Siddhartha could not allow himself to dwell on their pain. The questions that drove him forward had become more compelling than any earthly attachment. The newly ordained seeker made his way through the dense forests of northeastern India, following paths worn by countless wanderers who had undertaken similar journeys before him. This was the land of spiritual experimentation, where traditional Brahmanical orthodoxy was being challenged by revolutionary thinkers who sought direct experience of truth rather than inherited wisdom. Ascetics of every description could be found meditating in caves, practicing extreme austerities by riverbanks, debating philosophy in forest clearings. For someone raised in royal luxury, the physical hardships of homeless wandering were severe. Siddhartha's feet, accustomed to silk slippers, cracked and bled on rocky paths. His skin, once protected by palace walls, burned under the fierce sun and shivered in mountain cold. Hunger became a constant companion, as he learned to survive on whatever simple food charitable householders might offer, or whatever fruits and roots the forest provided. Yet these physical discomforts were nothing compared to the psychological upheaval of his transformation. Every assumption about identity, purpose and meaning that had structured his existence for nearly 3 decades had been abandoned. He was no longer a prince, no longer a husband, no longer a father. He possessed no name that carried weight, no titles that commanded respect, no wealth that could purchase comfort. He had become what Buddhist texts would later call one gone forth, a being who had stepped outside all conventional categories of social existence. The first teacher Siddhartha encountered was Alara Kalama, a renowned sage who had mastered the deepest levels of meditative absorption known to the spiritual traditions of his time. Kalama taught the attainment of the sphere of nothingness, a state of consciousness so refined that all ordinary mental activity ceased. Under his guidance, Siddhartha proved to be an extraordinary student, quickly mastering techniques that took most practitioners years to develop. Within months, the former prince had achieved the same level of realization as his teacher. The experience was profound beyond description. In the deepest states of absorption, all sense of individual selfhood dissolved. There was no Siddhartha, no body, no thoughts, no emotions, no awareness of the external world. Only pure consciousness remained, empty of all content, yet somehow luminously aware. Alara Kalama was so impressed with his students' rapid progress that he offered to share leadership of his community. Here was someone who had mastered in months what had taken the master decades to achieve. But as Siddhartha emerged from these exalted states and returned to ordinary consciousness, he realized that nothing fundamental had changed. The questions that had driven him from the palace remained unanswered. Age, sickness, and death still awaited him and all beings. The suffering inherent in existence had been temporarily transcended, not permanently eliminated. With profound respect for his teacher, but unwavering commitment to his quest, Siddhartha took leave of Alara Kalama's community and continued his search. The second teacher he encountered was Uddaka Ramaputta, who had surpassed even Kalama's attainments by reaching the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, the most subtle state of consciousness possible within the realm of form. Once again, Siddhartha's natural aptitude for meditative practice served him well. He mastered this even more refined absorption, experiencing states of consciousness so subtle that language becomes meaningless in describing them. Uddaka Ramaputta was even more impressed than the previous teacher had been, offering not just partnership, but complete leadership of his following. Here was a student who had surpassed the master himself. But again, as the effects of these extraordinary states faded and ordinary awareness returned, Siddhartha found that the fundamental problem remained unsolved. These achievements, remarkable as they were, represented peaks of human consciousness, but not the liberation he sought. They offered temporary escape from suffering rather than permanent transcendence. The practitioner could rise to these exalted states, but inevitably had to return to ordinary existence, where aging, sickness, and death continued their relentless work. The realization that even the highest meditative attainments available in his time were insufficient to solve the problem of existence marked a crucial turning point in Siddhartha's quest. If the greatest spiritual teachers of the age could not provide the answers he sought, he would have to find his own path. This decision, required courage of an almost unimaginable magnitude. He was choosing to abandon not just worldly success, but spiritual success as well, venturing into territory that no teacher could map for him. The path he chose was one of extreme asceticism, following practices that pushed the human body and mind to their absolute limits. This was not uncommon among serious seekers of his era, who believed that liberation required the complete subjugation of physical desires and limitations. If attachment to bodily pleasure was the root of suffering, then perhaps the complete denial of all bodily needs would lead to freedom. Siddhartha settled in a forest grove near the village of Uruvela, where he began practicing austerities that would have killed a less determined seeker. He reduced his food intake to single grains of rice per day, then to nothing at all for extended periods. His body, once strong and beautiful, became skeletal. His skin took on the colour of old leather. His hair fell out. His eyes sank deep into their sockets. 5 other ascetics, impressed by the intensity of his practice, joined him in this extreme pursuit. They believed they were witnessing someone who would achieve the ultimate liberation through the complete transcendence of physical existence. Stories of his austerities spread throughout the region, and people came from great distances to witness this extraordinary display of spiritual determination. For 6 years, Siddhartha continued these practices with unwavering dedication. He learned to endure pain that would have driven ordinary people to madness. He discovered that consciousness could persist even when the body was reduced to little more than a skeleton wrapped in skin. He pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be human, exploring states of deprivation that revealed the profound depths of mental and physical endurance. Yet as his body wasted away and his strength diminished to almost nothing, the same troubling realization began to emerge. The extreme asceticism, like the extreme meditative absorptions he had mastered earlier, was not producing the fundamental transformation he sought. If anything, the weakness of his body was beginning to impair his mental clarity. The very tool he needed for investigation, his consciousness, was being compromised by the destruction of its physical support. The breakthrough came on a day when Siddhartha was so weakened by his practices that he collapsed while walking. As he lay on the ground, barely conscious, a memory from his childhood arose unbidden in his mind. He recalled a day when his father had taken him to witness the ceremonial ploughing that marked the beginning of the agricultural season. While the adults were occupied with the ritual, young Siddhartha had wandered away and sat beneath a rose apple tree. In that peaceful setting, with no particular effort or intention, the child had spontaneously entered a state of profound meditative absorption. Unlike the states he had later achieved through intense striving, this childhood experience had been characterized by ease, clarity, and a sense of complete well-being. The memory was so vivid that even in his current weakened condition, he could recall the quality of consciousness that had emerged naturally when the mind was neither indulging in pleasure nor torturing itself with deprivation. Lying there in the forest, Siddhartha had what would later be recognized as one of the most important insights in spiritual history. The path he had been following, like the path he had abandoned at the palace, was based on extremes. One extreme sought happiness through sensual indulgence, the other through sensual denial. But perhaps the truth lay neither in indulgence nor in denial, but in a middle way that avoided both extremes, while incorporating the wisdom of each. The insight was revolutionary, not just for its content but for its source. It had not come from a teacher, a scripture, or even from intense meditative practice. It had arisen from the simple recognition that his current approach was not working, combined with the memory of a natural state of well-being he had experienced without any technique at all. This suggested that liberation might not be something to be achieved through extreme effort, but something to be uncovered by removing the obstacles that prevented its natural manifestation. With this realization, Siddhartha made another decision that shocked his 5 ascetic companions. He would abandon the extreme austerities and begin eating normally again. When a village girl named Sujata offered him a bowl of milk rice, he accepted it gratefully, breaking a fast that had lasted for days. The 5 ascetics, disgusted by what they saw as his abandonment of the spiritual path, left him alone in the forest. But Siddhartha was not abandoning his quest, he was refining it. As strength returned to his body and clarity to his mind, he began to formulate an approach to liberation that was unlike anything that had been attempted before. It would not rely on extreme indulgence or extreme denial, but on a careful balance that allowed both body and mind to function optimally in service of the deepest investigation possible. The stage was now set for the most crucial phase of his journey. Having mastered the highest meditative attainments of his time and pushed ascetic practices to their absolute limits, having abandoned his birthright and the security of established teachings, Siddhartha was finally ready to undertake the investigation that would either lead to complete liberation or to the final acknowledgement that such liberation was impossible. He made his way to a large Bodhi tree near the village of Bodhi, its broad canopy providing shelter, its strong roots offering stability. Here, in the dappled light filtering through the leaves, he prepared for what he somehow knew would be the decisive confrontation with the nature of existence itself. Spreading a simple grass mat beneath the tree, he assumed the cross-legged posture of meditation and made a vow that would echo through history. He would not rise from that spot until he had found the answers he sought. No matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles arose, no matter what physical or psychological challenges presented themselves, he would continue his investigation until the truth was finally revealed. It was a commitment that required absolute courage, for he was staking everything on the possibility that human consciousness could penetrate to the very heart of reality. As the sun set on what would become the most important night in the history of human spiritual development, Siddhartha settled into meditation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that everything depended on what would unfold in the hours ahead. The homeless wanderer who had once been a prince was about to undertake a journey into consciousness itself, a journey that would transform not only his own understanding, but the spiritual possibilities available to every human being who would follow. The hours that followed would test the very foundations of human consciousness. As darkness enveloped the forest around Bodhi, Siddhartha began what Buddhist tradition would later describe as the most intense psychological and spiritual battle ever waged by a single individual. But this was no external conflict fought with weapons and armies. This was an internal war against the deepest delusions and attachments that bind human beings to cycles of suffering. The first challenge came from within his own mind, manifesting as what the texts call Mara, the personification of temptation and spiritual obstruction. This was not a literal demon, but rather the collective force of every psychological pattern that keeps consciousness trapped in ignorance. As Siddhartha deepened his meditation, these forces marshalled themselves for what they seemed to recognize as a final confrontation. The attack began with desire. Visions arose of sensual pleasures, more exquisite than any he had known, even in his palace days. Beautiful forms danced before his inner vision, offering delights that promised to satisfy every craving the human heart could imagine. The memories of Yasodhara's embrace, of sumptuous feasts, of silk against his skin, all returned with vivid intensity. His body, weakened by years of asceticism, but now restored to health, responded to these images with the full force of biological drive. For lesser minds, this assault might have been overwhelming. The visions were so compelling, so perfectly crafted to appeal to human weakness, that abandoning meditation to seek their fulfillment would have seemed entirely reasonable. But Siddhartha's years of training had prepared him for exactly this moment. He observed the arising of desire without being swept away by it, recognizing these visions as products of his own consciousness rather than external realities demanding response. When the temptations of pleasure failed to dislodge him from his purpose, the attack shifted to fear. The comfortable meditation that had begun the evening transformed into a psychological storm of terrifying intensity. Visions of death arose, not the peaceful passing he had witnessed in the funeral procession, but violent, agonizing destruction. He saw his body torn apart by wild animals, consumed by disease, destroyed by accidents. The fears that every human being carries in the depths of consciousness suddenly manifested with hallucinogenic vividness. But death was only the beginning. The fears multiplied and intensified, each one precisely calibrated to his individual psychology. He saw his father dying alone, calling out for the son who had abandoned him. He witnessed Yasodhara struggling to raise their child in poverty after the kingdom fell to enemies. He experienced the terror of complete annihilation, of discovering that consciousness itself was merely an illusion that would dissolve at death, leaving nothing but emptiness. Through it all, Siddhartha maintained his investigation. The years of meditation had taught him to observe mental phenomena with scientific precision, and he applied this skill even to the most overwhelming psychological experiences. He noticed how fear arose in consciousness, how it gripped the body, how it created stories about future disasters that existed nowhere but in imagination. By observing rather than identifying with these experiences, he began to understand their true nature. As the night progressed, the challenges evolved into even more subtle forms. Pride arose with devastating force, reminding him of his royal heritage, his intellectual brilliance, his mastery of meditative states that had impressed the greatest teachers of his time. Why should someone of his accomplishments sit in the dirt like a common beggar? He could return to Kapilavastu, claim his throne, and use his power to help countless people. Surely that would be more beneficial than this selfish pursuit of personal liberation. The argument was compelling precisely because it contained elements of truth. He could indeed help many people if he returned to worldly power. But Siddhartha recognized this as perhaps the most dangerous temptation of all, the spiritual pride that disguises selfishness as altruism. If he had not solved the fundamental problem of suffering in his own consciousness, what could he really offer others except more sophisticated forms of the same delusions that trapped everyone? The final and most devastating challenge came not from desire, fear, or pride, but from doubt. As the night wore on, and his investigation deepened, a voice arose in his mind, questioning the very foundations of his quest. Perhaps there was no liberation to be found. Perhaps the teachers who had achieved the highest meditative states were right, that temporary transcendence was the best possible outcome. Perhaps the suffering inherent in existence was simply the price of being alive, and the wisest course was acceptance rather than this desperate seeking for something that might not exist. This doubt was more dangerous than any of the previous challenges because it attacked the motivation that had sustained him through 6 years of the most difficult practices imaginable. If liberation was impossible, then everything he had sacrificed, every hardship he had endured, every relationship he had abandoned, had been for nothing. The weight of this possibility pressed down on him with crushing force. But it was precisely at this moment of deepest doubt that Siddhartha made the crucial breakthrough. Instead of being overwhelmed by the uncertainty, he began to investigate doubt itself with the same precision he had applied to desire and fear. What was this doubt? Where did it arise? What was its true nature? And in that investigation, he began to glimpse something that had been hidden beneath all the various mental phenomena he had been observing. There was something in consciousness that remained constant through all the changes. Desire arose and passed away. Fear came and went. Pride swelled and subsided. Doubt emerged and dissolved. But something remained aware of all these transformations without being touched by them. This awareness was not created by any of these mental states, nor was it destroyed when they disappeared. It was simply present, clear and undisturbed by the drama playing out within it. As this recognition deepened, Siddhartha began to understand that he had been making a fundamental error throughout his spiritual quest. He had been trying to achieve liberation by manipulating the contents of consciousness, either through extreme pleasure, extreme asceticism, or refined meditative states. But liberation was not a matter of getting consciousness into any particular state. It was a matter of recognizing what consciousness actually was beneath all its temporary contents. The breakthrough came just before dawn. As the first hints of light began to penetrate the forest canopy, Siddhartha's investigation reached a depth that revealed the very structure of existence itself. He saw with perfect clarity how suffering arose, how it was perpetuated, and how it could be ended. But more than understanding suffering, he recognized the deathless, unchanging awareness that had never been touched by suffering in the first place. In that moment of recognition, the seeker who had sat down beneath the Bodhi tree ceased to exist. In his place sat someone who would be known to history as Buddha, the awakened one. The transformation was not a change from one thing to another, but the recognition of what had always been present. It was like suddenly seeing that what had appeared to be a snake in dim light was actually a rope. Nothing had changed except perception, but that change in perception altered everything. The first hours after this awakening were spent in what the texts describe as the bliss of liberation. For 7 weeks, the newly awakened Buddha remained in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree, experiencing the profound peace that comes from the complete resolution of all spiritual seeking. The questions that had driven him from his palace, that had sustained him through years of the most difficult practices, had finally been answered definitively. But as the initial euphoria of awakening settled into a more stable understanding, a new question arose. What should he do with this knowledge? The realization he had achieved was so subtle, so contrary to ordinary human thinking, that he doubted whether anyone would be able to understand it. The path he had discovered required a degree of mental refinement and psychological courage that seemed beyond the capacity of most people. According to the traditional accounts, the Buddha initially considered remaining silent, living out his days in the peaceful solitude of forest meditation. The truth he had discovered was so profound, so complete, that sharing it almost seemed unnecessary. He had found what he was looking for. The quest that had begun with a young prince's first glimpse of old age, sickness, and death had reached its ultimate resolution. But as he contemplated this possibility, the Buddha's natural compassion began to assert itself. He remembered the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him when he gave up extreme practices. He thought of his father, still waiting for a son who would never return to claim a throne. He considered Yasodhara raising their child with questions that might never be answered. Most of all, he reflected on the countless beings throughout the world who were struggling with the same fundamental problems that had once tormented him. The decision to teach was not made lightly. The Buddha understood that attempting to communicate his realization would involve enormous challenges. Language itself was inadequate to convey insights that transcended conceptual thought. Students would inevitably misunderstand, creating new forms of delusion from teachings designed to eliminate delusion entirely. The very act of teaching would require him to translate a direct, immediate understanding into words and concepts that could only point toward truth rather than containing it. Nevertheless, compassion ultimately overcame hesitation. If even a few individuals could benefit from hearing about the path to liberation, the effort would be worthwhile. The Buddha made the decision that would transform his personal awakening into a world religion that would eventually reach every continent and influence billions of lives. His first impulse was to seek out his former teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, to share with them the discoveries that had grown from the foundation they had provided. But when he extended his consciousness to locate them, he perceived that both had died during his 6 years of seeking, the opportunity to repay their kindness with the ultimate teaching had been lost to the impermanence that governed all conditioned existence. Instead, the Buddha turned his attention toward the 5 ascetics who had been his companions during the years of extreme austerities. Despite their disappointment when he abandoned those practices, they had been sincere seekers who might be capable of understanding what he now had to offer. Through the intuitive knowledge that had awakened with his liberation, he perceived that they were residing in the deer park at Sarnath, not far from the holy city of Varanasi. The journey from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath became the Buddha's first steps as a teacher. As he walked the dusty roads of northeastern India, he began the complex process of translating his wordless understanding into concepts that could be communicated to others. The challenge was immense. How could he convey in human language an insight that transcended all human categories? How could he use thoughts and words to point beyond thought and word toward direct experience? The solution he developed would prove to be one of the most skillful teaching methods ever devised. Rather than attempting to describe his ultimate realization directly, the Buddha decided to focus on practical instructions that could lead others to discover the same truth for themselves. He would teach not what liberation was, but how it could be achieved. He would offer not descriptions of awakened consciousness, but methods for awakening consciousness. This approach required enormous psychological sophistication. Different students would need different approaches depending on their temperament, background, and level of spiritual development. Some would benefit from ethical training, others from meditative instruction, still others from philosophical analysis of the nature of reality. The Buddha would need to become not just an awakened being, but a master physician of consciousness, capable of diagnosing exactly what each individual needed to progress toward liberation. As he approached Sarnath, the Buddha could see his 5 former companions in the distance, still engaged in the ascetic practices he had abandoned. Their initial reaction to his approach was one of disdain. Here was the man who had given up the spiritual life for comfort, who had shown weakness when strength was required, who had proven himself unworthy of their company. They agreed among themselves not to show him the respect due to a serious practitioner. But something had changed in the Buddha's presence that was immediately apparent even to those predisposed to dismiss him. There was a quality of peace and authority that commanded attention despite their intentions to ignore him. As he drew nearer, the ascetics found themselves unable to maintain their planned indifference. Something in his bearing, his movement, the very atmosphere that surrounded him, suggested that a profound transformation had taken place. When the Buddha reached their meditation grove, the 5 ascetics found themselves rising to greet him almost involuntarily. The man they had known as Siddhartha was clearly present, but he had become something more. There was a depth in his eyes, a stillness in his presence, that spoke of mysteries they could barely imagine. Without being able to articulate why, they found themselves treating him with the reverence due to an accomplished teacher. The Buddha's first words to them were gentle but direct. He explained that he had found the path they were all seeking, that the liberation they hoped to achieve through extreme practices was indeed possible, but through methods that transcended both indulgence and deprivation. He offered to share with them the understanding that had emerged from his night beneath the Bodhi tree, the insights that could free them from the cycle of suffering that bound all unawakened beings. Initially, the 5 ascetics were skeptical. They had seen Siddhartha abandon the practices they still considered essential for spiritual progress. How could someone who had given up the rigorous discipline they maintained claim to have achieved what they were still working toward? But as the Buddha began to speak, describing experiences and insights that resonated with their own deepest understanding, while transcending anything they had previously imagined, their skepticism began to give way to wonder. The teaching that followed would become known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the initial presentation of the path to liberation that the Buddha had discovered. But it was not delivered as a philosophical discourse or mystical revelation. Instead, it was presented as practical instruction for ending suffering, clear steps that anyone with sufficient dedication could follow toward the same awakening the Buddha had achieved. The foundation of his teaching was what he called the Four Noble Truths, insights so fundamental that they would form the basis of all subsequent Buddhist doctrine. The first noble truth was the recognition that suffering was an inescapable aspect of unawakened existence. Not just obvious suffering like illness and death, but the subtle dissatisfaction that permeated even the most pleasant experiences due to their impermanent nature. The second noble truth identified the cause of this suffering as attachment, the mind's tendency to grasp after experiences, trying to make permanent what was inherently temporary. This attachment arose from ignorance of the true nature of reality, from the mistaken belief that lasting satisfaction could be found in temporary phenomena. The third noble truth was perhaps the most revolutionary. The complete cessation of suffering was possible. This was not mere philosophical speculation, but the Buddha's direct testimony based on his own experience. Liberation was not a distant goal, but an achievable reality for anyone willing to undertake the necessary training. The fourth noble truth outlined the path to this liberation, what the Buddha called the Noble Eightfold Path. This was not a series of steps to be followed sequentially, but an integrated approach to spiritual development that addressed every aspect of human existence: ethical conduct, mental cultivation, and the wisdom that arose from understanding the true nature of reality. As the Buddha elaborated on these teachings, the five ascetics began to experience profound shifts in their understanding. The rigorous mental training they had undergone through years of ascetic practice had prepared them to grasp subtleties that might have been lost on less prepared minds. One by one, they began to have direct insights into the truths the Buddha was describing, moving from intellectual understanding to immediate realization. The first to achieve breakthrough was Kondana, the eldest of the group. As the Buddha explained the nature of impermanence and the futility of attachment, something shifted in Kondana's consciousness. The intellectual understanding he had carried for years suddenly became living knowledge. He saw directly how suffering arose from the mind's attempts to grasp the ungraspable, and in that seeing, the grasping itself began to dissolve. The Buddha recognized the moment of Kondana's awakening and spoke words that would become legendary. Kondana has understood. Kondana has understood. It was a moment of profound joy, the first confirmation that the path the Buddha had discovered could indeed be walked by others. The teaching that had begun as an experiment in communication had proven successful. The Dharma could be transmitted. Over the following days, the remaining four ascetics each achieved their own breakthrough moments. The Buddha worked with each one individually, adjusting his teaching methods to match their particular needs and temperaments. Some required more emphasis on ethical purification, others on meditative development, still others on analytical investigation of the nature of mind and reality, but all eventually reached the same fundamental recognition that had transformed their teacher beneath the Bodhi tree. With 5 awakened disciples, the Buddha now had the foundation of what would become the monastic community, the Sangha. These were not merely students who had learned new concepts, but individuals who had undergone the same fundamental transformation of consciousness that the Buddha himself had experienced. They could serve as living examples of the possibility of liberation, proof that the path was not merely theoretical, but practically achievable. The success at Sarnath marked the beginning of what would become a 45-year teaching career. Word of the Buddha's awakening and the liberation of his first disciples began to spread throughout the region. People came from great distances to hear this new teaching, this middle way that promised liberation through neither indulgence nor extreme deprivation, but through the direct investigation of consciousness itself. The audiences were as diverse as the society of ancient India itself. Wealthy merchants came seeking teachings that could bring peace to minds troubled by the uncertainties of commerce. Brahmins arrived to debate the philosophical implications of the Buddha's insights. Kings and princes sought audiences, hoping to find in these teachings solutions to the problems of governance and the burdens of power. Ordinary householders came with their daily struggles, looking for practical guidance on living with less suffering and more wisdom. Each group required a different approach, and the Buddha proved to be a master of skillful means, adapting his presentation to the needs and capacities of his audience while never compromising the essential insights that form the core of his teaching. To intellectuals, he offered sophisticated philosophical analysis. To those burdened by ethical conflicts, he provided clear moral guidance. To experienced meditators, he taught advanced practices. To beginners, he offered simple techniques for developing mindfulness and concentration. But regardless of the approach, certain themes remained constant throughout all his teachings: the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena, the suffering that arose from trying to find lasting satisfaction in temporary experiences, the possibility of liberation through understanding, and the practical path that could lead to that understanding. These insights, first articulated in the deer park at Sarnath, would form the foundation of a teaching tradition that would eventually span the globe. As the Buddha's reputation grew, he found himself at the center of a movement that was transforming the spiritual landscape of ancient India. The established religious authorities, threatened by teachings that questioned their monopoly on spiritual truth, began to organize opposition. Political leaders, uncertain about the implications of a teaching that transcended caste and social hierarchy, viewed the growing community with suspicion. Even some of the Buddha's own followers struggled with the radical implications of his insights, but the power of the teaching itself overcame all obstacles. Those who seriously engaged with the Buddha's methods found that they worked exactly as promised. Suffering decreased, wisdom increased, the quality of life improved not through the acquisition of external goods, but through the transformation of internal understanding. The path the Buddha had discovered beneath the Bodhi tree proved to be as effective for others as it had been for him. The homeless wanderer, who had once been Prince Siddhartha, had become something unprecedented in human history, a fully awakened teacher whose insights into the nature of consciousness would eventually influence the spiritual development of much of humanity. But this was only the beginning of a story that would unfold across continents and centuries, touching countless lives with the possibility of liberation from suffering. The Buddha who emerged from those first teachings at Sarnath was no longer the seeker who had left his palace in search of answers. He had become the answer itself, or rather, he had become someone who could point others toward the answers they carried within their own consciousness. The questions that had begun with a young prince's first encounter with old age, sickness, and death had been resolved in a way that offered hope to everyone struggling with the same fundamental challenges of human existence. The transformation that had begun beneath the Bodhi tree would soon face tests that no amount of meditation could have prepared him for. As word spread throughout the kingdoms of northeastern India about the awakened teacher and his revolutionary message, the Buddha found himself navigating challenges that extended far beyond the realm of spiritual instruction. The path from personal liberation to establishing a movement that could preserve and transmit these insights across generations would prove to be as demanding as his original quest for enlightenment. The first major test came when wealthy merchants and influential families began seeking audiences with the Buddha. Unlike the ascetics and wandering seekers who had formed his initial following, these individuals brought with them the complex web of social obligations, family loyalties, and economic interests that defined civilized society. They were attracted to his teachings but reluctant to abandon the responsibilities that gave their lives structure and meaning. Among these early lay followers was Anathapindika, a merchant whose wealth rivaled that of kings. He had heard reports of the Buddha's teaching and travelled great distances to meet this remarkable teacher. When he arrived at the modest grove where the Buddha was staying, Anathapindika expected to find someone living in luxury befitting his reputation. Instead, he discovered a man who possessed nothing beyond his robes and begging bowl, yet radiated a contentment that all his riches had never provided. The conversation that followed would establish the template for how the Buddha would work with householders for the remainder of his teaching career. Rather than demanding that Anathapindika abandon his wealth and family to become a monk, the Buddha showed him how the same insights that led to monastic liberation could be applied within the context of ordinary life. The principles remained the same, but their application adapted to circumstances where complete renunciation was neither possible nor necessary. This flexibility in application, while maintaining consistency, in essence became one of the Buddha's greatest strengths as a teacher. He recognized that liberation was not dependent on any particular lifestyle, but on understanding the nature of consciousness itself. A wealthy merchant who truly grasped the impermanent nature of his possessions could be more free than a monk who remained attached to his spiritual achievements. The external circumstances mattered less than the internal transformation. Anathapindika's devotion to the teaching led him to make an unprecedented offer. He wished to purchase a park on the outskirts of Savatthi, where the Buddha and his growing community of monks could establish a permanent residence. The location he had chosen belonged to Prince Jeta, who agreed to sell, but set an impossible price. The land must be covered entirely with gold coins. Without hesitation, Anathapindika began having cartloads of gold brought to the site, literally carpeting the earth with precious metal. Prince Jeta, amazed by this display of devotion, was moved to contribute the trees and buildings to the project without charge. The resulting monastery, known as Jetavana, became the Buddha's primary residence for the final decades of his life. Here, surrounded by gardens and meditation halls, the Buddha would spend countless hours teaching, often addressing audiences that included some of the most powerful and influential people in ancient India. But success brought its own complications. As the Buddha's following grew, internal disputes began to emerge within the monastic community. Different monks developed preferences for different aspects of his teaching, some emphasizing meditation, others focusing on ethical conduct, still others drawn to the philosophical analysis of reality. These differences of emphasis gradually hardened into factions, each convinced that their particular approach represented the Buddha's true intention. The most serious challenge to unity came from the Buddha's own cousin, Devadatta, a monk whose spiritual accomplishments were genuine, but whose motivation remained tainted by worldly ambition. Devadatta had achieved considerable psychic powers through his meditation practice and attracted a devoted following among younger monks who were impressed by his abilities. But rather than using these accomplishments to deepen his understanding, Devadatta began to see them as evidence of his superiority over other teachers, including the Buddha himself. The conflict reached a crisis when Devadatta publicly challenged the Buddha's leadership of the community. He argued that the Buddha, now in his 70s, was too old to provide effective guidance. He proposed that the community should adopt stricter rules than those the Buddha had established, including permanent residence in forests, complete vegetarianism, and the wearing of robes made only from discarded cloth. These proposals were designed to appeal to monks who felt that the Buddha's middle way was insufficiently rigorous. When the Buddha refused to endorse these changes, Devadatta accused him of becoming soft and compromised by his success. He gathered several hundred monks and established a rival community, claiming to represent the authentic teaching that the Buddha had abandoned. For the first time since his awakening, the Buddha faced the painful reality that his own insights could be distorted and used to justify positions that contradicted everything he had discovered. The Buddha's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his wisdom as both a spiritual teacher and a leader of human beings. Rather than engaging in public disputes or attempting to force his critics into submission, he simply continued teaching with the same clarity and compassion he had always demonstrated. He neither condemned Devadatta nor tried to win back the monks who had followed him. Instead, he used the situation as an opportunity to clarify the essential principles that distinguish genuine Dharma from its counterfeits. The test of authenticity, the Buddha explained, was not the severity of the rules or the impressiveness of psychic displays, but the practical results produced in the lives of practitioners. Did the teaching lead to greater wisdom, compassion, and freedom from suffering? Did it reduce the ego's grip on consciousness or strengthen it? Did it promote harmony within communities or create division? These pragmatic criteria provided a way to evaluate spiritual claims that transcended arguments about authority or tradition. Gradually, many of the monks who had initially been attracted to Devadatta's stricter approach began to recognize that their new leader's motivation was tainted by the very pride and ambition that the Buddha's teaching was designed to eliminate. They returned to the original community, often with deeper appreciation for the Buddha's balanced approach after experiencing the alternative. Devadatta himself, isolated by his own arrogance and consumed by jealousy, eventually died in bitterness, a cautionary example of how spiritual accomplishments could become obstacles when pursued for the wrong reasons. This painful episode taught the Buddha important lessons about the challenges of preserving authentic teaching across time. It became clear that establishing the Dharma required more than just awakened individuals. It needed institutional structures that could maintain the integrity of the teaching while adapting to changing circumstances. The Buddha began developing a more formal organizational structure for the monastic community, with clear guidelines for decision-making, dispute resolution, and the transmission of authority. The rules he established, known as the Vinaya, were not arbitrary restrictions but practical guidelines based on his observations of what promoted spiritual development and what hindered it. Every rule had emerged from specific situations where the lack of clear guidance had created problems within the community. Rather than imposing an abstract code of conduct, the Buddha was responding to the actual needs of people trying to live together while pursuing the most demanding goal imaginable: the complete transformation of consciousness. As the monastic community stabilized, the Buddha turned his attention to a challenge that would prove even more complex: establishing guidelines for lay practitioners who wished to follow his teaching while remaining engaged with family and society. These individuals faced temptations and obligations that monks could avoid through renunciation, yet they sought the same fundamental liberation from suffering that had motivated the Buddha's own quest. The solution he developed was revolutionary for its time. Rather than creating a simplified version of monastic practice, the Buddha offered lay followers the same profound insights that form the core of his teaching, adapted to their particular circumstances. A householder could achieve the same essential understanding as a monk, though the expression of that understanding might take different forms. For lay practitioners, ethical conduct became especially important as a foundation for spiritual development. Without the protective environment of monastic life, individuals needed clear guidelines for navigating the moral complexities of ordinary existence. The Buddha articulated 5 basic precepts that could serve as a foundation for anyone seeking to live wisely: avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxication. These precepts were not mere rules, but training principles designed to reduce the mental agitation that made meditation and wisdom development difficult. Each precept addressed a particular way that unconscious behavior could reinforce the very patterns of attachment and delusion that the Buddha's teaching was designed to eliminate. By following these guidelines, lay practitioners created conditions in their daily lives that supported rather than hindered their spiritual development. The Buddha's work with lay followers led to some of his most practical and accessible teachings. He offered guidance on marriage relationships, child rearing, business ethics, and social responsibilities that demonstrated how awakened consciousness could express itself through ordinary activities. The same mindfulness that monks cultivated in formal meditation could be applied to any activity, transforming routine tasks into opportunities for spiritual development. One of his most devoted lay students was Visakha, a wealthy woman whose intelligence and dedication impressed even the most accomplished monks. She became the Buddha's primary supporter among women practitioners, organizing communities of female followers and demonstrating that gender was no barrier to achieving the highest levels of spiritual realization. Through her example, and that of other accomplished women, the Buddha established that awakening was equally available to all human beings, regardless of their social position or biological characteristics. The inclusion of women as full participants in the spiritual community was controversial in the highly stratified society of ancient India. Traditional religious authorities maintained that women were spiritually inferior and incapable of achieving liberation. The Buddha's willingness to ordain women as nuns and to acknowledge their achievements as teachers challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and spiritual capacity. This challenge to social orthodoxy extended beyond gender to questions of caste and class. The Buddha's teaching explicitly rejected the notion that spiritual capacity was determined by birth circumstances. A person's potential for awakening depended on their understanding and effort, not on their family background or social position. This radical egalitarianism attracted followers from all levels of society, while also creating powerful enemies among those whose authority depended on maintaining traditional hierarchies. The political implications of the Buddha's teaching became particularly apparent when kings and princes began seeking his guidance. These rulers faced the practical challenge of governing societies while attempting to apply insights originally developed for individual liberation. How could a king exercise necessary authority while remaining free from attachment to power? How could justice be administered without creating karma through punishment? How could armies be maintained without violating the precept against killing? The Buddha's responses to these dilemmas revealed his profound understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. He neither condemned political authority as inherently corrupt, nor endorsed it as spiritually neutral. Instead, he showed how the same principles that governed individual awakening could be applied to the exercise of power, creating the possibility of governance that served both practical needs and spiritual development. King Bimbisara of Magadha became one of the Buddha's most important royal supporters, demonstrating how political power could be wielded with wisdom and compassion. Under the Buddha's influence, Bimbisara reformed his kingdom's legal system to emphasize rehabilitation over revenge, established hospitals and educational institutions, and created policies that reduced rather than increased suffering among his subjects. His example inspired other rulers to consider how their governing philosophy might reflect deeper spiritual principles. But the Buddha's influence on political leaders also created new dangers. Rival kingdoms, threatened by the growing power of rulers who followed the Buddha's guidance, began viewing his teaching as a political threat rather than a spiritual movement. Some attempted to use violence to suppress the spread of his influence, while others tried to co-opt his teaching for their own purposes, claiming divine sanction for policies that contradicted everything he had taught. These challenges forced the Buddha to develop sophisticated strategies for protecting his teaching from both persecution and distortion. He established networks of supporters across multiple kingdoms, ensuring that the suppression of his movement in one location would not eliminate it entirely. He trained multiple generations of accomplished teachers, reducing dependence on any single individual for the preservation and transmission of his insights. Most importantly, he began the process of systematically recording his teachings in forms that could be memorized and transmitted accurately across time. The oral tradition that preserved his words was organized with extraordinary precision, using repetition, rhythm, and mnemonic devices that made exact preservation possible, even without written texts. Teams of monks specialized in memorizing different collections of teachings, creating redundant systems that protected against the loss of crucial instructions. As the Buddha entered the final decade of his life, he could see that the movement he had initiated had grown far beyond anything he had originally envisioned. What had begun as a simple sharing of his personal insights with 5 ascetics had become a comprehensive system for human development that addressed every aspect of existence. The teaching that had emerged from his solitary awakening beneath the Bodhi tree was now embedded in institutions that could preserve and transmit it across centuries. Yet this success brought a new kind of responsibility. The Buddha understood that his physical presence would not be available indefinitely to guide the development of his teaching. The community that had grown around him would need to function effectively without his direct oversight, maintaining the integrity of his insights while adapting to circumstances he could not anticipate. The final years of his life became increasingly focused on preparing his followers for the transition that would come with his death. The challenge was immense. How could a teaching that depended so fundamentally on direct experience be preserved when the one who had achieved the ultimate realization was no longer available for consultation? How could future generations distinguish between authentic applications of his insights and distortions created by well-meaning but misguided interpreters? How could the essence of awakening be transmitted through words and concepts when awakening itself transcended all conceptual frameworks? The Buddha's solution to these challenges would prove to be as revolutionary as his original insights into the nature of consciousness. Rather than attempting to create a rigid system that could not adapt to changing circumstances, he established principles for ongoing discovery that could guide future practitioners in applying his insights to situations he had never encountered. The teaching he left behind was not a fixed doctrine, but a living method for investigating reality that could remain effective regardless of external circumstances. As he prepared for his final journey, the Buddha could reflect on a transformation that had begun with a young prince's first glimpse of suffering and had culminated in a global movement dedicated to ending suffering for all beings. The questions that had driven him from his palace had been answered in ways that provided hope for everyone struggling with the fundamental challenges of human existence. But the full implications of what he had set in motion would only become apparent in the centuries that followed his death, as his insights spread across continents and cultures, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining their essential power to liberate consciousness from the chains of ignorance and attachment. The wandering teacher, who had once been Prince Siddhartha, was about to undertake his final journey, but the path he had opened would continue to beckon seekers for millennia to come. The Buddha's greatest achievement was not his own awakening, but his demonstration that awakening was possible for anyone willing to undertake the investigation he had pioneered. The light that had dawned beneath the Bodhi tree would continue to illuminate the darkness of ignorance, long after its first bearer had passed into the deathless peace he had discovered in the depths of his own consciousness. The depths of his own consciousness. In his 80th year, the Buddha began what would become his final rainy season retreat in the town of Beluva near Vaisali. The monsoon rains that year seemed heavier than usual, drumming against the simple shelters where he and his attendant Ananda sought refuge from the seasonal storms. But it was not the weather that weighed most heavily on those who gathered around their aging teacher. The Buddha's body, which had endured decades of the most demanding spiritual practices, followed by 45 years of constant travel and teaching, was beginning to show signs of the inevitable decline that awaits all physical forms. The first serious indication came during the retreat itself. The Buddha fell gravely ill with what the texts describe as severe pains in his abdomen, accompanied by dysentery that left him weak and barely able to stand. For several days, those closest to him feared that death might claim him without warning, leaving crucial teachings unspoken and important preparations incomplete. Ananda, who had served as his constant companion for the past 25 years, was particularly distressed by the possibility of losing his teacher before receiving final guidance about the future of the community. But the Buddha rallied his failing strength through what he described as an act of will, determining that he would not pass away without first providing clear instructions for those who would carry on his work. The recovery was temporary and incomplete, but sufficient to allow him to address the concerns that weighed on his followers' minds. When Ananda expressed relief at his teacher's improvement, the Buddha's response revealed his clear understanding of what lay ahead. "Ananda," he said, with the gentle directness that had characterized his teaching for decades, "I am now old, worn out, venerable, one who has traversed life's path. I have reached my sum of days. I am turning 80 years of age. Just as an old cart is held together with the help of leather straps, so the body of the Buddha is kept going only with supports. It is only when I withdraw from external objects and enter into contentless concentration that my body is more comfortable." The implications of these words were not lost on his devoted attendant. The Buddha was preparing both himself and his community for the transition that could no longer be delayed. But rather than treating his approaching death as a defeat or tragedy, he was presenting it as the natural culmination of a life fully lived in accordance with the truths he had discovered. The body that had carried his consciousness through the most extraordinary spiritual journey in human history was simply wearing out like any other conditioned phenomenon subject to impermanence. What followed was a series of teachings and conversations that would become known as the Buddha's final instructions, preserved with particular care by those who understood their ultimate significance. The Buddha used his remaining time to address the practical and philosophical questions that would inevitably arise after his death, providing guidance that could help his followers navigate the challenges of maintaining authentic Dharma without his direct presence. One of the most crucial conversations took place as the Buddha and Ananda walked slowly through the countryside around Vaisali, visiting the various shrines and meditation spots where important teachings had been given over the years. The Buddha spoke with unusual emphasis about the possibility of extending his life through the application of psychic powers he had long ago mastered. He mentioned repeatedly that one who had developed such abilities could remain in the body for a full cosmic age if the circumstances warranted it. The hints were clear, but Ananda, overwhelmed by grief at his teacher's condition and perhaps influenced by the same forces that had once tempted the Buddha himself, failed to make the obvious request. Only later, when the Buddha announced his intention to pass away in 3 months' time, did Ananda realize that he had been given an opportunity to ask his teacher to remain longer in the world. The moment had passed and the Buddha explained that such a request could no longer alter what had been set in motion. The exchange revealed something profound about the Buddha's understanding of his own role and the nature of authentic spiritual teaching. He had accomplished what he had set out to do. The path to liberation had been discovered, tested, and established in forms that could be transmitted across generations. His continued physical presence, while comforting to his followers, was no longer necessary for the preservation and spread of his insights. Indeed, prolonged dependence on any individual teacher, even an awakened one, could become an obstacle to the independent understanding that each practitioner needed to develop. The announcement of his impending death sent ripples of shock and sorrow throughout the communities that had formed around his teaching. Monks and nuns who had devoted their entire adult lives to studying with him struggled to imagine continuing their practice without his guidance. Lay followers who had found refuge in his wisdom felt suddenly orphaned, uncertain how they would navigate life's challenges without access to his counsel. But the Buddha's response to their distress demonstrated once again his extraordinary skill as a teacher of human beings. Rather than offering false comfort or encouraging dependence, he used the crisis of his approaching death as an opportunity for his followers to discover their own capacity for wisdom and leadership. The teachings he had shared over 4.5 decades contained everything necessary for complete liberation. His physical presence had been helpful in clarifying and applying those teachings, but it was not essential for their effectiveness. "Be islands unto yourselves," he told the assembled community in one of his final major discourses. "Be your own refuge with no other refuge. Let the Dharma be your island. Let the Dharma be your refuge with no other refuge." How does one become an island unto oneself? By observing the body in the body with mindfulness, observing feelings in feelings, mind in mind, and mental phenomena in mental phenomena, ardent, clearly aware, and mindful, having removed desire and aversion toward the world. The instruction was both practical and profound. On one level, it provided specific meditation techniques that could be practiced without external guidance. But more fundamentally, it pointed toward the self-reliant understanding that had always been the goal of his teaching. The Buddha had never wanted to create followers who depended on his authority for their spiritual development. His aim from the beginning had been to help individuals discover the same capacity for awakening that he had found within his own consciousness. As word spread of the Buddha's announcement, people began traveling from great distances for what they understood might be their final opportunity to receive teachings directly from him. Despite his physical weakness, the Buddha continued to offer guidance to all who sought it, adapting his presentations to the needs of each audience while maintaining the essential insights that formed the core of his message. Among those who came seeking final teachings was Siddhartha, an elderly, wandering ascetic who had spent decades studying with various teachers without finding the satisfaction he sought. Local monks initially tried to prevent him from disturbing their ailing teacher, but the Buddha overheard the commotion and insisted that Siddhartha be allowed to approach. The conversation that followed became significant, not only for its content, but as the Buddha's final act of teaching. Siddhartha presented a question that had troubled him throughout his spiritual quest. Among all the various teachers and methods available in ancient India, how could a sincere seeker determine which approach would lead to genuine liberation? The religious landscape was crowded with competing claims and contradictory instructions. Some teachers emphasized ritual purity, others intellectual understanding, still others devotional practices or extreme austerities. How could anyone navigate this confusion to find authentic guidance? The Buddha's response was characteristically direct and practical. The test of any spiritual teaching, he explained, was not the impressiveness of its claims or the charisma of its teacher, but the quality of practitioners it produced. Did the method lead to genuine wisdom, ethical conduct, and liberation from suffering? Did it create individuals who embodied the very qualities it claimed to develop? These pragmatic criteria provided a way to evaluate spiritual approaches that transcended arguments about authority or tradition. More specifically, the Buddha pointed to what he called the Noble Eightfold Path as the distinguishing characteristic of authentic Dharma. Any teaching that included right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration would be capable of producing genuine awakening. Conversely, systems that lacked these elements, regardless of their other qualities, would be unable to deliver the liberation they promised. Siddhartha found this explanation so compelling that he requested immediate ordination as a monk, becoming the Buddha's final personal disciple. The elderly seeker, who had spent decades searching for truth, had finally found what he was looking for in the last teachings of a dying master. Within hours of his ordination, Siddhartha achieved the same awakening that had eluded him through years of study with other teachers, providing dramatic confirmation of the Buddha's assertions about the effectiveness of his method. The Buddha's final journey took him slowly northward through the familiar landscape of northeastern India, visiting for the last time the places where crucial moments of his teaching career had unfolded. Each stop became an opportunity to offer guidance tailored to local conditions and concerns, while also providing closure for communities that had supported his work for decades. At Pava, he accepted what would be his final meal from Kunda, a metal worker who had prepared a special dish in honor of the great teacher's visit. The exact nature of this meal has been debated by scholars for centuries, with some suggesting it contained pork and others arguing for a type of mushroom or truffle. What is certain is that shortly after eating, the Buddha became violently ill with symptoms that clearly indicated his death was imminent. Despite his suffering, the Buddha was careful to ensure that Kunda would not be blamed for his condition. He instructed Ananda to tell the metalworker that offering the final meal to an awakened being was an act of great merit, comparable to the offering that had preceded his enlightenment 45 years earlier. This concern for a simple householder's feelings, even while experiencing severe physical distress, exemplified the compassion that had motivated his entire teaching career. The final destination was Kushinagara, a small town that seemed an unlikely location for such a momentous event. When Ananda expressed disappointment that his teacher would die in such an obscure place, rather than in one of the great cities where his influence had been most strongly felt, the Buddha revealed that Kushinagara had been the capital of a great kingdom in ages past. The choice of location was deliberate, a final teaching about the impermanence that governs all conditioned phenomena, even the mightiest human institutions. In a grove of sal trees on the outskirts of Kushinagara, the Buddha instructed Ananda to prepare a simple bed between two trees. The setting was peaceful and natural, far removed from the luxury of the palace where his life had begun, or the elaborate monasteries that had been built to honour his teaching. As he lay down on his right side in the position that would become iconic in Buddhist art, the Buddha appeared completely at peace, showing no fear or regret about the transition he was about to undergo. The sal trees, though it was not their season, suddenly burst into bloom, showering the dying teacher with unseasonable flowers. Celestial music was heard in the air, and divine fragrances filled the grove. These miraculous signs, whether literal or symbolic, expressed the profound significance of what was taking place. The consciousness that had first awakened beneath the Bodhi tree was preparing to demonstrate the final teaching about the nature of conditioned existence. Throughout the night, various disciples approached for final instructions and clarifications. The Buddha patiently answered each question, providing guidance that would help his followers maintain the integrity of his teaching after his death. To some, he offered encouragement about their practice. To others, he provided specific techniques for overcoming particular obstacles. To all, he emphasized the importance of diligent effort in applying the methods he had taught. As dawn approached, the Buddha asked 3 times whether anyone had remaining doubts or questions about his teaching. The silence that greeted each inquiry confirmed that his work of instruction was complete. Everything necessary for the achievement of liberation had been communicated clearly and thoroughly. The path he had discovered through his own struggle was now available to anyone with the dedication to walk it. His final words, spoken with the clarity and authority that had characterized his teaching for 45 years, encapsulated the essence of everything he had learned and shared. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. With this ultimate instruction, the Buddha entered the deepest meditative absorptions, moving systematically through increasingly subtle states of consciousness until, with complete awareness and equanimity, he passed beyond all conditioned existence into the deathless peace he had first discovered as a young seeker beneath the Bodhi tree. The great teacher who had begun his journey as Prince Siddhartha, who had become the Buddha through his own courageous investigation of reality, had completed the final demonstration of his teaching. Death, which had first troubled him as a young man witnessing a funeral procession, was revealed to be not an enemy to be feared, but a natural transition to be met with the same mindful awareness applied to every other experience. The grief of his followers was profound and genuine, but it was tempered by their understanding of what they had witnessed. The Buddha's death was not a defeat but a victory, not an ending but a fulfillment. The consciousness that had achieved perfect liberation could not be destroyed by the dissolution of its physical support. More importantly, the insights that had emerged from that consciousness had been preserved in forms that could continue benefiting beings for countless generations. The immediate practical challenge facing the Buddha's followers was how to honor their teacher's passing while ensuring the preservation of his legacy. The decision was made to cremate the body with the honors befitting a universal monarch, acknowledging both his royal birth and his achievement of spiritual sovereignty over the forces that bind ordinary consciousness to cycles of suffering. The funeral pyre, when lit, burned with extraordinary intensity, reducing the Buddha's physical form to relics that would become focal points for devotion and remembrance throughout the Buddhist world. These material remains were divided among the various kingdoms and communities that had supported his teaching, providing tangible connections to the historical figure who had made liberation accessible to ordinary human beings. But the true relics of the Buddha were not physical objects, but the teachings and methods he had developed through decades of working with the full spectrum of human consciousness. These intellectual and practical inheritances would prove far more durable than any material remains, spreading across vast distances and adapting to diverse cultures while maintaining their essential power to awaken understanding in prepared minds. The immediate successors to the Buddha's leadership faced the enormous challenge of maintaining the integrity of his teaching while adapting to circumstances he had never directly addressed. Within months of his death, a great council was convened to systematically review and organize the vast body of instructions he had given over 45 years of teaching. Teams of monks who had specialized in memorizing different collections of his words worked together to create comprehensive records that could be transmitted accurately to future generations. The process revealed the extraordinary richness and complexity of what the Buddha had accomplished. His teachings addressed every aspect of human experience, from the most basic ethical guidelines for ordinary life to the most subtle instructions for advanced meditative practices. He had developed methods suitable for people of every temperament and capacity, creating a comprehensive system for human development that could remain effective across diverse cultural contexts. More than just a collection of techniques, the Buddha's legacy included a way of approaching spiritual development that emphasized direct experience over blind faith, practical results over theoretical speculation, and compassionate wisdom over selfish achievement. These methodological principles would prove as important as any specific instruction, providing criteria for evaluating new applications of his insights as his teaching spread to cultures and circumstances he had never imagined. The Buddha's death marked not the end of a story, but the beginning of a transformation that would eventually touch every continent and influence billions of lives. The prince who had abandoned his throne to seek answers to humanity's deepest questions had found those answers in a way that made them available to anyone willing to undertake the same journey of investigation. the homeless wanderer who had nearly died pursuing liberation, had discovered a path that could be walked by people living ordinary lives in ordinary circumstances. The questions that had driven Siddhartha from his palace, the same questions that trouble thoughtful people in every generation, had been resolved in a manner that offered genuine hope for the end of suffering. But the full implications of what he had achieved would only become apparent as his insights spread across the world, demonstrating again and again their capacity to transform human consciousness regardless of cultural background or historical circumstance. The Buddha's greatest gift to humanity was not any particular teaching or technique, but his demonstration that awakening was possible. The liberation he had achieved was not unique to his individual consciousness, but represented a potential that exists within every human being. His life and death had opened a door that could never again be closed, revealing possibilities for human development that would continue inspiring seekers for millennia to come. In the years immediately following the Buddha's passing, his prediction about the challenges facing his teaching proved remarkably prescient. The communities he had established across northeastern India found themselves grappling with questions that had seemed distant and theoretical while their teacher lived among them. Without his physical presence to provide clarification and guidance, disagreements emerged about the proper interpretation of instructions that had once seemed perfectly clear. The first major crisis arose within just a few months of his death, when a monk named Purana returned from an extended retreat to discover that a great council had been held to systematize the Buddha's teachings. When invited to confirm the accuracy of what had been compiled, Purana politely declined, stating that he would remember the Dharma exactly as he had heard it from the Buddha's own lips. This seemingly minor incident revealed a fundamental tension that would shape the development of Buddhism for centuries to come. The problem was not simply one of memory or accuracy, though those concerns were certainly present. More fundamentally, it reflected different understandings of what constituted authentic transmission of the Buddha's insights. Some emphasized the letter of his instructions, believing that preservation required exact reproduction of his words and methods. Others focused on the spirit of his teaching, arguing that true fidelity might require adaptation and interpretation as circumstances changed. These philosophical differences manifested in practical disputes about monastic discipline, meditation techniques, and the relationship between the community and the broader society. Monks who had studied with the Buddha for decades found themselves disagreeing about issues they thought had been settled definitively during his lifetime. The unity that had seemed so natural under his direct guidance began to fracture, along lines that would eventually create distinct schools and traditions. From a sheltered prince who had never seen suffering to an awakened teacher whose wisdom would transform the world, the Buddha's journey reveals the extraordinary potential that lies within human consciousness. His path from the golden cage of his palace to the liberation found beneath the Bodhi tree demonstrates that awakening is not reserved for a chosen few, but represents a possibility available to anyone willing to undertake the same courageous investigation of reality. The questions that drove him from his comfortable life are the same ones that call to seekers in every age, and the answers he discovered continue to offer genuine hope for the end of suffering.